Just going to wait and see if we have anyone joining. All right, you guys. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual tour of the Timken Museum. We are excited to have you all with us, but here are a few things to keep in mind just before we get started. If you all could please keep yourselves muted throughout today's presentation, that would be amazing. And if you have any questions, feel free to use the Zoom chat function by clicking the button on the bottom of your screen that says chat in order to type your question, and we'll be happy to address any questions or comments at the end of today's tour. And if you are joining us from Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. If you have any questions, you can use the comment section on Facebook, and we'll be monitoring those questions and comments as well. And we'll be answering those at the end of our tour also. Lastly, this tour is being recorded and streamed live, and it will be posted on our social media channels once the tour is over. If you would like to rewatch the tour or watch other tours put on by the Timken Museum previously, please check out those on our Facebook, and you can find those there. So without further ado, I am excited to announce Docent Karen as she discusses the German Renaissance. So thank you all so much for being here today, and I'm going to turn things over to Karen right now.
Thank you, Haley. Haley is a new intern with the Timken, and welcome, Haley. So we'll begin talking about the German Renaissance by looking at one of the greatest proponents of the German Renaissance, and that, of course, is the great Albrecht Dürer. Albrecht Dürer in the North was sort of the Leonardo da Vinci of that era and that time period and that area. So what is the German Renaissance? How do we describe it? Well, first of all, it's quite different than other things that are going on in the Renaissance. It's later. What I mean by that is because of the Bavarian Alps as sort of a geographical barrier, the Renaissance came much later to Germany. Even though in the north, in places like Bruges and Antwerp and Ghent, what would be today Belgium, art was flourishing in the 15th century as a development of the Renaissance, if you look at Jan van Eyck, for example. But in Germany, this was delayed. So the styles were a little bit more international Gothic, medieval in sort of stylistically. So it's a sort of a different sensibility, although there is some overlapping because, of course, Italian artists were coming into Germany, and artists from the region, which would be today Belgium, were also popular. Again, Jan van Eyck, Roger van der Weyden, and they were influencing some of these German Renaissance artists. Now, humanism began to spread even into Germany, and that was a very important cultural element to the Renaissance. This idea of learning, humanism, classical antiquity. It wasn't part of the German landscape as it was in Italy, for example, when you could look around and see Roman ruins, for example. But the interest in antiquity was apparent. Something else you should know, even though Germany was not tremendously populated, it wasn't a very populated country at this time, economically it was very strong. They had textiles and banking and metallurgy and mining and and bookmaking. So they were very important economically. Also, two extremely fundamental aspects of the German Renaissance that we need to discuss, and that was the Protestant Reformation and also the development of the printing press. So let's look at the development of the printing press. Gutenberg begins the use of movable type around 1440, and that allows for religious treatises to be published, more information to be circulated, and also some theologians and philosophers were beginning to translate the Bible into German as opposed to just Latin, which helped to disseminate information. And again, the Protestant Reformation. So in 1517, Martin Luther nails the 95 edicts to the church, and he was a professor at Wittenberg, and he wants to change some of the aspects of the Catholic Church. And he begins to get a lot of support from other theologians. For example, John Calvin in France is interested in it. Erasmus, earlier on, Dutch philosopher, had talked about the need for humanism and reforms in the Catholic Church. We have a man named Conrad Celtis, who lived from 1459 to 1508, who was a philosopher, theologian, and he too was disseminating information, and a man named Johann Reuchlin. And Reuchlin lived from 1455 to 1522. So these are people who were spreading the idea of moving away from devotion to the Catholic Church, becoming more humanistic, more interested in classical ideas, and really moving away from this sort of medieval Gothic trend. Now, when you look at this masterful work by Albrecht Dürer, and we're going to discuss it a little bit further as we move along, you can see the influence of the Italian painters, particularly in the city of Venice. And he had already been in Venice when this painting was done. But I want to go back and sort of show you this link of medieval Gothic, international Gothic style that was pervasive in Germany in the 15th century and would not be quite considered Renaissance. This man, Stephen Lochner, was part of what we call the Cologne School. And the Cologne School produced some really amazing artists, as did another school called the Danube School. The Danube School was known for its beautiful landscapes, which included things like the abbeys and the castles and the churches and the monasteries that dotted the landscape of Germany. And with that said, I do want to talk about the fact that as they moved away from these Catholic themes during the Reformation, and there was two branches, Calvinistic, Lutheran. The Lutheran branch under in Germany was a little bit more still kind of clinging to some of the iconography and imagery, whereas the Calvinists were a little more stricter and less inclined to continue the use of Catholic iconography. However, if you look at the date, this is before the Protestant Reformation. And let me just tell you a little bit about the Cologne School that Lochner was part of. They were active in this medieval city of Cologne, probably from about 1350 to about 1550. And they did a lot of altarpieces. And this one, of course, was influenced by French painting and illuminated manuscripts that were being circulated. Of course, they were done by hand. This is just about the time of the printing press. And they were influenced a bit by Italy, too. Here, however, we are looking at something that is very Flemish, very much like the work of Jan van Eyck. And why is that? Look at the coloration. Look at the delicate features. Look at the attention to detail. That is a very Flemish stylistic concern. And so this altarpiece was eventually about 1810 put in the Cologne Cathedral, but at this time it was not. It was in the St. Maria of Jerusalem convent. And here we have Mary enthroned with the wise men circulating around, and they're looking at this beautiful, delicate little Jesus. And we have all manner, it looks like crusaders behind him carrying flags. We have this beautiful tracery. And this right here was something found often in Gothic cathedrals, this beautiful tracery, this patterning. Most often it was done in stone, but here it is embellishes the triptych through panel painting. As I said, normally it would have been in stone in an architectural way. Here it is used to embellish. Now, what do we have here? We have Saint Ursula, one of the patron saints of Cologne, and behind her are 11,000 followers, women who were all martyred for their beliefs. So this is on the left. And then on the right, we have Saint Jeroen. And he was actually the patron saint, another patron saint of Cologne. He was a Roman soldier who believed in Christianity. You can see the cross on his garment, and he too was martyred. So this is actually, although it's beautifully done, very delicate, really carries a lot of the concepts of that Flemish Renaissance, which was really, very active at this time. Jan van Eyck, subsequently Roger van der Weyden, and also Hans Memling. And we're going to look at that work. So one other thing I want to mention is this beautiful carpet of grass, this attention to the landscape and botanical elements. It was very popular with the German painters. And so it's kind of like a paradisiacal, as they say, a paradisiacal landscape. I'm going to show you one more painting by this great Cologne artist, sort of predates the Renaissance in Germany. Stefan Lochner did the Madonna of the Rose Bower in such a beautiful way. If you didn't know any better, you might even think it was done by someone like Jan van Eyck because of this really beautiful use of the oil painting and the rich, rich color of the garments. So Mary is almost always shown in blue with elements of red. Here we have blue. She sits on a red velvet cushion. We have multiple musicians, angels, who are entertaining her. We have this exquisite rose bower, and we have red and white roses, her purity and the passion. We have God above. God is Pantocrator with the white dove, the Holy Spirit. And Jesus here holds an apple to signify the apple of the Garden of Eden. And then we have these magnificent angels, cherubs, and they're pulling back a delicate tapestry. So this, and then we have to bring out a few very decorative elements. She wears a medallion of, and you might not be able to see it, but I'm going to point to it here, is a unicorn. And what does a unicorn mean? Well, the unicorn is a symbol of Jesus in the sense that a unicorn is a singular animal, very unique animal, and that kind of represents the oneness of God. We also have her wearing a beautiful crown as the Mary of the heavens, the Queen of the heavens, and then this magnificent gold halo as is here. And you can see it almost looks like a acanthus, which also is a reference to Jesus. And the peacock, you can see some peacock feathers here, and that refers to immortality. So this is a beautiful segue, this Cologne artist who is in what we would consider more of a Gothic style, not quite Renaissance. Now, as I mentioned, the Renaissance is going on in Italy, in Siena, in Florence. It's going on in the Netherlands, in particular, the region that is now Belgium. So it does show a bit of a delay, but that is not to take away from the exquisite nature of this image. Lastly, I do want to say that stylistically, the International Gothic style, which comes really from France, is really apparent. And that was promoted too with these illuminated manuscripts that were very popular among the aristocracy and such. We're going to go on to another important German artist who really helps to spread the word of the Renaissance, and that is Martin Schongauer. So one thing that the German artists, particularly Schongauer and Albrecht Dürer, did to help disseminate information back and forth was the use of multiple imagery. The Germans were masters at woodblock print, etchings, all manner of duplicates, multiples. And that's why when you think about the printing press, it just makes so much sense because they were constantly looking at ways to multiply artwork, religious information, pamphlets, propaganda, and that sort of thing. So Martin Schongauer was famed as being one of the greatest graphic artists of that time. He was also a celebrated artist. He did some magnificent paintings. His work, he traveled. He went to Spain and Italy, so he was a very well-traveled artist, as well as his work was very well-traveled. He was very influenced by the great Brussels artist Roger van der Weyden, and we're going to look at one of van der Weyden's disciples, so we can see, if you look at these faces, they are very reminiscent of Van der Weyden's St. Luke painting the Virgin, for example. So you see a lot of this Flemish influence. He came from the Alsatian region of Colmar, where the great Eisenheim altarpiece is located, and I'm going to show you that in just a moment. So Colmar, Cologne, these are really important cities and the Danube area for the development of the German Renaissance. So he did a lot of engravings. His technique was masterful. So Albrecht Dürer was a really great admirer of Schongauer, and you can see a little bit of Schongauer's influence on Albrecht Dürer. So let's look at this Orleans altarpiece. It was commissioned by Jean de Orleans. He was in Eisenheim. And so these are the outer wings. This was a multiple panel painting, but the central panel is lost. I don't have any information about what happened, but it does not exist today. So we have on my left, the Madonna, and then we have Gabriel, the angel of the Annunciation. And this is a very popular theme. And we have, again, those peacock feathers, immortality. We have the white lily, and that is in Majorca ware, and that is a beautiful reference to Mary's purity. We have these exquisite tapestries, because remember, textiles were very popular in the north, in places like today, Belgium and Germany. And so we see a lot of references to the use of tapestries. Some of them were coming eventually from Persia and the Middle East, but that comes a little bit later. So we have the white dove. We have God with the Salvator Mundi, the crystal orb, savior of the world, reference to Jesus too, the beautiful contrapposto poses, and this magnificent use of color. Remember, it was Jan van Eyck who promoted the use of oil painting. He did not invent it, but his work was very inspirational. So the white lily, her virginity, and she's a very radiant and beautiful Mary. Okay, and we're going to go on. And now we're going to look at something that really shows the influence of humanism, because we're looking at these shepherds and they're not idealized in any way. If you look closely, they have very kind of rough faces, but very human faces and very realistic faces. And they bend in prayer, their hands clutched, and they have their straw hats, and it's so magnificently detailed. What's interesting is it's a very crowded space, but yet the landscape creates another dimension. And as I said, with this Danube school, they really concentrated on the landscape. And not necessarily that Schongauer was part of the Danube school, but that he was influenced by the beautiful landscape around Germany. Another thing is when you move away from a lot of, not in this painting because this is Catholic, but if you look at some of the paintings that are more in the realm of the Protestant ethos, you will see more interest in landscape and portraiture, because they moved away from these big church commissions and started to do smaller pieces as they did in Holland in the 17th century. So let's look at Joseph, and Joseph is quite a bit older than Mary. He looks at his beautiful wife, and she's quite young. And then we look at this immaculate conception, immaculate birth, I should say. There's no blood. There's no umbilical cord. There's no detritus from birth. It's just a pristine, beautiful baby who lies on a cloth, a rough-hewn cloth. I mean, you can see it's not a beautiful textile, it's torn, there's hay. And then we have the remnants of a shelter, and then this alpine landscape, just exquisite. And it's very interesting how he creates this dimension by layering the wise men, or sorry, the shepherds. All right, we are going to look at one of my favorite artists, and I was very blessed recently to have visited, and I told you this at after my last lecture on Dutch Baroque. I had about a month ago, I spent a couple weeks in Belgium, and I was very blessed to have been able to go to in Bruges, the St. John's Hospital, which is now a museum and a repository for 7 of the greatest works by Hans Memling. And Memling actually died at St. John's Hospital, and I believe that is why they use that as a repository for his work. But let's talk a little bit about him. I often use artists who sort of are in both camps, because even though today the Flemish artists, Flemish art historians will say, oh, Hans Memling, we put him in the camp of Flemish artists. He really was German, and he was lived in Cologne for a while until he was 31. And then he moved to Brussels to study with the great Roger van der Weyden. He was a disciple of van der Weyden. And then eventually he goes into Bruges, and he is the second generation of those Flemish painters, such as I mentioned, Jan van Eyck, Master Flamel, Roger van der Weyden. And so he settled in Bruges in 1465, and he combined the northern sensibility, and I'm, of course, including Germany in that northern sensibility, with an Italianate stylistic and coloration. He was very popular. He was considered absolutely brilliant. I think that this is one of the most exquisite images of Christ that has ever been done. It is at the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena, and I can't, let's say, express to you enough how amazing the Norton Simon Museum is. If you want to look at some masterpieces by Zurbaran, there's a Giorgione, there's a Memling, Hugo van der Goes. I mean, they have an exquisite Renaissance and Baroque collection, and other works, of course, Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. But this is in the Norton Simon, and it's Christ giving his blessing. Now, look, if you first look at it, you think, oh, it's kind of like icons, that icon style. But no, it's a devotional piece, yes. There's no gold background. It's a very austere background. And Christ holds his fingers in benediction at a ledge, like a windowsill. And he looks at us with such a human style. The hair, the wispy beard, the penetrating eyes, the detail, the realism, the human Christ. It's like an outstanding version of Christ. And when we go a little further into the talk and I show you the work, the Eisenheim altarpiece, you can see that Christ is not often shown in such a, and I say banal and not in a pejorative sense, but sort of banal. He's not tortured. He's not crucified. He's not riddled with holes or pain. It's beautiful. It's human. And again, it kind of likens to early, more like Byzantine icons. So I hope that one day you do get to see this small, beautiful version of Christ. So something that doesn't really right away appear to be a work by Memling, but I do want to mention, this is probably one of the most complicated sets of panels. And most art historians, it's very hard to find information that's been substantiated. So in other words, some of this is conjecture, and I will try to do my best to give you some important aspects to this. Now, it was said that this could have been recto verso. So often in panels, this is shown here as a triptych, 3-panel altarpiece. Recto verso means that you have imagery on the front, verso on the back. We have some recto versos in the Timken, at least for example, we have a Russian icon, the 40 Martyrs, and that is a recto verso on the fiery furnace. This is also recto verso, but we don't know if it's meant to be 6 panels spread out, clusters of 4. It's really not completely known. So Memling, as I mentioned, worked with Roger van der Weyden in Bruges. He was his successor. So you see this kind of odd imagery. So what do we have on my left is death. And there's all kinds of these memento mori. Remember when we talked about Dutch painting, for example, memento mori, these mementos that life is fleeting and death. And there can't be anything more obvious than a skull and bones. So death is coming out of the ground. They've moved the door away, and it shows how he could have died. Interesting that they do show genitalia, which is kind of remarkable. And then he has an inscription here in this sort of death head. Now, next to him is Vanity. And she's shown as a beautiful woman. Of course, genitalia is shown, but very sort of mellow in a depiction. She shows a mirror. And, you know, they often talked in the North about be careful of being too vain. It can lead to problems. Here it seems a little bit mellow because we have what appears to be hunting dogs here and perhaps a laugh dog. And we have this exquisite countryside with a very muted palette. We don't see those vigorous colors that we often see in Northern painting. And then here we have something that is really, again, we're not quite sure of. And that is either hell or redemption through Jesus. So we were not really sure if we're looking at hell and damnation, because we have this depiction of Satan, just this horrific depiction of Satan, and then we have these humans writhing down below, and then a jawbone. So this monster here, I don't know if you can quite see it, but it's an open mouth monster with an eye here, and these people are kind of being spewed out of the mouth. So again, not quite sure if it is a redemption through Jesus or exactly just a depiction of hell. But this is a pretty complicated altarpiece, multiple panel piece that, we still don't know a tremendous amount about it. All right, we've got to devote some time to this genius. One of my, someone asked me, tell me, in all of art history, who do you just think about and like to read about? And I have to say Albrecht Dürer. I just have to say that he, to me, is one of the most brilliant artists who ever lived. He's known, he was a prodigy. He was already apprenticed with his father, who was a goldsmith. And there's some kind of indication of that as we move on a little bit. He was born in Nuremberg, and Nuremberg was a really important city economically, and the university was there. So he was very aware of what was going on eventually with the Protestant Reformation. He loved to travel, and he made at least 2 trips to Italy. He went to Venice. He worked for Maximilian. He was very well-established artist, even when he was very young. This is when he was 26 years old. He was greatly influential to the spread of ideas from north to the south, and then the Italian artists loved his work and began to really gravitate toward it. So he was a segue between the north and south in the Venetian, using the Venetian style. Color was a big thing to him. So let's just talk a little. Also, we have to remember that he was a writer, a scientist, in the fact that, like Leonardo da Vinci, he loved to examine human form and nature. If you look at his famous The Hare, piece of turf, you know that he was studying botanical elements. He was a printmaker and an engraver. He did a lot of multiple imagery like Schongauer. So his ideas were very well known. Okay, so let's look at this remarkable self-portrait. Now, there's a later self-portrait that I hope you take the moment to look at. He faces you in the front, and his hair is sort of this very curly mop of hair, and he looks directly at you. This is not the one, but this one I do want to talk about. The reason why I bring that other one up is just one of the most remarkable self-portraits I have ever seen. This is a remarkable one too. So let's talk a little bit about it. At the time that this portrait was done, he had been in Italy. He was 26 years old, and he was already a very established artist. He was elevated in his stature. He shows that he was very proud of his accomplishments, and he wears rather kind of an effeminate outfit, very decorative, and is very Italian. He folds his hands in an unusual manner. Now, this is not typical of Albrecht Dürer, the way the hands are folded, especially for an artist. He wears gloves, and I've told you many, many, many times, but worth repeating, hands are the most difficult part of the human body for artists to depict. So he does it quite remarkably. He has this beautiful mop of curly hair and this stunning cap, and it's all kind of color coordinated. There's an arch here above his head. His head's kind of a little bit diminished just because of the arch above, although it doesn't take away from his handsome face. Look at this alpine landscape. Again, the influence of the Danube School, these mountains, and then eventually we would see archaeological elements, but this is quite beautiful. So you have this dimensionality, you have this beautiful coloration that, of course, he picked up in his travels in Italy. So we'll go and look at another piece. Okay, so here's the three wise men and adoration of the Magi. And look at this color. He had seen the work of Giorgione and also the Bellini brothers, Mantegna, who was a brother-in-law to the group, one of the Bellini brothers. So he knew a lot about Italian painting. The Venetians were interested in color. The northern artists, the German artists, for example, were interested a little bit more in line, less interested in depictions of light. Now, that is not true for the Flemish and Dutch painters, but the German artists weren't quite as fanatical about the depictions of light. But here we have an altarpiece. Now, this is different than a lot of altarpieces because it wasn't a triptych or a polyptych or diptych. Is one panel, but it was commissioned by Frederick the Wise of Saxony, and he ordered this for his church chapel, private chapel. And it shows the three kings, and Madonna is in blue, and I mentioned that she's often in blue and red, and she holds the little baby Jesus in this very rural setting. And here we have the elder of the wise men, and that's Melchior, and he brings a container of gold, and the little baby Jesus is clutching it rather in a charming way. And then we have, pardon me, Caspar. And Caspar, we think, is probably a self-portrait by Durer. So that's probably Durer here, and we think that is. And then we have the beautiful Balthasar, and he is the young man, and he brings gifts. So I do want to reference a couple other things, allegorically speaking, of the three wise men, because at this time, they not only represent the ages of man. Oh, I beg your pardon. Hold on. Oops. Oh no, we've just had a little glitch here. I hope I can log back in. Here we go. Good. The one thing I just want to mention here is that not only do we have the ages of man, older, middle-aged, younger, but they represent the continents known to man at this time, the European man. So we have Africa, Asia, and of course, Europe. Also, in this magnificent landscape, highly detailed, we have a turban wearing individual who is pulling gifts out of his bag, and that creates a little bit of movement. And then in the side panel middle ground, we have what looks like aristocrats gathering on horseback, and this alpine landscape, an alpine lake, and then a castle on the hill, and then these ruins here, a little bit more rustic as we get closer to the foreground, and then the manger. And these animals, very realistic animals looking forth. And of course, all the detail, the butterfly, the butterfly, the plants, all kinds of naturalistic elements. And so again, these men are standing in this one in counterposto and as in a sculptural form. And then we have all the elements of the Magi, gifts and costumes, and the baby Jesus leans so carefully. But the color is so Venetian, but with a very northern twist. All right. So we're going to look at the Madonna of the Pair, one of my favorites. And I do want to make a comment, and this was made by Saint Bonaventure. If you let me make this quote that relates to this painting, and then tell me what you think. We can talk about that after the presentation. So the gift of the wise is sweetness of the mouth and heart. So that by Saint Bonaventure. Let's try it again. Gift of the wise is sweetness of mouth and heart. Something that I guess we all should think about. It's a very touching sentiment. So this is an exquisite detail of a very beautifully detailed mother and child. One thing I wanted to bring up a little bit earlier is Durer had a very unusual initialing, the A and then the D underneath. I think it's quite beautiful. So let's look at this Madonna. She's beautiful. She's exquisite. And he loved to paint the Madonna and Child. That was one of his favorite themes. And he was interested in the Reformation, of course, but he also had earlier done some Catholic themes. Madonna the Pair she gazes lovingly, the tonality of her face. There's a little bit of light as it falls, but not a deep, intense light, a softer light that falls on her. She has a exquisite, detailed headdress, the tendrils of her hair. Now she holds the baby he's a very buff kind of baby. I mean, he's kind of muscular and he twists in this sort of sculptural form, and he holds a little pear. And if you look very carefully, and I'm going to point it out to you, you can see the little nibbles in the pear. So he's used his little teeth, and you can see how important he is because she doesn't hold him with her bare hands. She holds him with a beautiful lavender cloth. She holds him like the precious jewel. So the theme is wisdom and sweetness and how sacred this is with a very human sensibility. All right. We're going to go on to a little bit of a more difficult set of images, and this is by Mathias Grünewald. Matthias Grünewald was a very brilliant man. He may have worked with Hans Holbein, whose work we're going to look at. He probably was also a hydraulic engineer. They have records of him doing work on that, so he was an artist, an engineer. He was one of the greatest artists of the 16th century. Although he might have worked a bit with Hans Holbein the Elder, he didn't really connect with a school or any group of artists. He worked kind of independently, although you'll see he did work with some sculptors. He had Protestant interests and Catholic interests, but he wasn't very prolific. So we're looking at what's called the Mocking of Christ, and it's a very crowded, sort of horrific image. We see Christ very tormented. He's twisted all around with those ropes, and they're pulling the ropes really tight, and they're about to slash him with another rope. And this monstrous person is going to hit him from behind or from atop. And then the odd faces, these sort of hideous faces, kind of reminds me of sort of the I don't know. Well, that's fine. We'll move on. Sort of these hideous mocking faces. And then something interesting, we have musicians. These musicians banging the drum, playing the flute, sort of entertaining these horrific tormentors. And this is the quote that I want to make that relates to this painting. It is this. A loss of a good man is a loss to all of us. So that is, of course, reference to Jesus. And again, this is a more Catholic theme because predates the Protestant Reformation. So we're going to talk about probably one of the greatest altarpieces ever done in the 16th century. And I just saw one of the greatest altarpieces, and that was again to altarpiece by Jan van Eyck and Hubert van Eyck. But this is also a partnership with Nicholas Hagenauer and Matthias Grünewald. I just want to mention a little bit about Hagenauer before I talk about the painterly elements of this. So this is in Colmar, and Colmar is a very, it's Alsatian, so it's German and French, and it has a pride of place there. Nicholas Hagenauer was German late Gothic sculptor, and he comes from the province of Hagenauer in Alsace, part of the Holy Roman Empire. And today it's part of France, actually. And so he was a sculptor, and he worked on the sculptural elements of the altarpiece. And we're only seeing right here the frame, but suffice to say, he did freestanding sculptural elements to this. So this is a very, very hard portion of the altarpiece to look at. I do want to tell you that this is a very elaborate altarpiece. We're just looking at it closed. Because when it's open, you see God, and the colors are fanciful, oranges and blues and all manner of imagery, really kind of shocking imagery, not shocking, and it just stylistically very unusual. The reason why I decided to show you the closed portion of it is because I think it's just the most interesting to me. So why does Jesus appear so riddled with these sores, and he looks to be in pain, and he's very low to the ground, and there's blood pouring out of him? He's dotted with these horrendous little marks. What it represents is that it was commissioned for a hospital for these workers, these religious workers who treated the sick, and they treated people with the plague. So these monks, they're called Antonine monks, who lived in a monastery, and they cared for people with the plague. They also cared for people with skin diseases, and there's a skin disease called I can't pronounce. Let me see if I can pronounce it. Ergotism, ergotism. Ergotism was a skin affliction that came from consuming wheat that was contaminated. And they implicate that in St. Vitus dance, like people went kind of crazy with that. And it's often considered something that might have affected the Salem witch trials and so forth. Okay, so what do we have? We have Mary being comforted by John the Evangelist. We have John the Baptist with Lamb of Jesus, representing Jesus. We have Mary Magdalene probably kneeling in sorrow, and Mary here is being comforted. We have Saint Sebastian, who is martyred. And on the other side, we have Saint Anthony Abbot, and he is being tortured by a monster that's coming through this window. It appears to be a window. So, and then we have, of course, the dead Christ here. So it's a very horrific exterior to this altarpiece. Something that's kind of interesting, though, is that John the Baptist with the lamb, it's really unusual that he is witnessing the crucifixion of Christ, because he was beheaded by Herod, and he did not witness Christ's crucifixion. So it's kind of an interesting element to the painting. We also have him calling out in Latin elements of the New Testament here. So that's also part of this altarpiece. But it is quite remarkable, highly detailed, and very sad. It's actually a very sad altarpiece. Okay, so we're going to go back just a second, and we're going to go on to the work of another artist, and his name is Wolf Huber. And Wolf Huber was part of the Danube School. You can see this magnificent landscape in the background. And then we have Christ taking leave of his mother. We think that Huber was a printmaker. He was also an architect, although we don't know too much about his architectural work. I don't think anything still exists. We know that he visited Italy. You can kind of see it. He was court painter to the Duke of Bavaria, so he had opportunity to travel, very influenced by Albrecht Dürer. And you see the edging of mannerism, because mannerism begins about between 1520 and 1530 in Italy and goes on to close to the end of the 16th century. But you start to see these elongated figures, very manneristic. We also think this was part of another panel because we see Jesus saying goodbye to his mother. He's taking leave, and they're all on these four Marys are helping her. Magdalene, Cleopas, etc. So they're comforting her, Mary Salome. They're comforting the fallen Mary, and she knows she will never see him again. And then we will, I mean, alive, that is. And then we have this exquisite Danube landscape, just exquisite. And you can see it's very unique, very German in its sensibility. So I'm going to move on to look at just the work of the great Hans Holbein the Younger. I'm not showing much of his father's work because he was considered more Gothic, and so now we're into the Renaissance, so I'm going to stick with the Younger. He was German-Swiss painter. He was a printmaker, one of the greatest portrait painters of the 16th century. He did religious art. In this image, he is doing a Catholic theme, but pretty soon during the Reformation, he was very supportive of the Reformation. He began to do more Protestant themes. He traveled to England and he painted portraits of Erasmus and the English Circle, Thomas More, Cromwell. He painted for Anne Boleyn, the wife of Henry VIII. So he was very well respected, very well liked. So here we have the Darmstadt Madonna, the Burgomaster of Basel, whose name was Jacob Myers. He commissioned this painting, and it's a very interesting painting because we have a lot of dead figures in the painting. So first of all, we have here Jacob Meyer Zoom Hansen. I'll just give him full name. And we have two little young sons, one a baby, one. And this represents the children that he lost, who died, which is really kind of sad. And then we have his young daughter who is betrothed, and she's wearing a crown of her situation. And then we have his wives, one first wife who had died and one who was still living. So he kind of includes past and present. It's a very Catholic theme, and this is one of his last themes in the Catholic imagery. We have a seashell, and that is, I'm trying to remember the scallop seashell reference to the Renaissance, and sculptural imagery right here. It's beautiful. Some vegetal elements, and then this elaborate costuming, and then of course a magnificent tapestry. And when we look at some of his other work, you will see that he was very interested in depicting carpentry, all kinds of beautiful cloth. Okay, so we're going to go on because we're getting a little behind schedule, as I always do. So one of the greatest double portraits ever done, or portraits ever done, by Hans Holbein is of the ambassadors. This is a very important painting. So on my left is Jean de Dintville, and he was he was a French diplomat. And then on his right is the Georges de Salves. And Georges de Salves this was done about a year before he became commissioned as an abbot. So he's sort of studying in his religious training, but he wears a very elaborate costume. It's not completely religious in nature. It's actually very decorative and beautiful because it has this fur element and it's very patterned. Well, so what is this all about? So it was said that Anne Boleyn probably commissioned this portrait to give to the ambassador right here. And it has something that I want to bring out that is completely remarkable. And that is what is called anamorphosis. Anamorphosis is right here. And anamorphosis is so unusual. And what it is when you have something that can be opened up and shown at a completely different angle. So this was meant to be seen as a death skull. And when the painting was seen, as you walk down the staircase, for example, you would see this death skull. Here you see it tilted and you're not quite sure what it is. What does it represent? Well, it represents a couple things. This could represent death right here. And then we have the terrestrial elements of life. And I'll tell you about that in just a second. And then here, the celestial. So we're also looking at the levels of life. And we see many objects that would be used for, this is navigation, and this is celestial navigation. So here we have the elements of looking at the night sky and studying the stars. And here we have something that is like a globe. Now we have a lute with a broken string, and that shows that there is a real bifurcation of the Catholic Church and the British and the English Church. And these two men were actually trying to work with Rome and sort of come to some kind of commonality after this beginning of the Protestant Reformation. That didn't go very well. So it was an unsuccessful meeting. We also have a Lutheran prayer book right here. And Holbein actually did depict people affiliated with the Protestant Reformation and Erasmus and others. So very important. Look at the exquisite textiles, this drape with all kinds of images on it. And then some of the patterning here on the floor. Some people would say it looks just like the patterning found in Westminster Abbey. So it shows the levels of life, and it shows celestial navigation. It shows all manner of objects that were used in the development of understanding of the sky and the world. So we'll move on just because I'm running a little bit slow. Okay, Lucas Cranach the Elder was a great influence with the spreading of the Protestant Reformation because he loved to paint Martin Luther, for example. And we think that this might have been the portrait of Luther's wife. We don't quite know who she was, but Lucas Cranach was a German painter and printmaker, loved to do woodblocks and engraving. He was a court painter to the Electors of Saxony, and he was known for portraits of German princes. And if you look at other members of the Protestant Reformation, as I mentioned, like Martin Luther, the aristocracy or the rich Germans loved his work because he catered to their sensibilities, these costumes, just elaborate jewelry and hair and just everything about this woman. And you can really tell Cranach's, he has a very identifiable facial characteristics. And then, of course, you can see these beautiful landscape in the background. And as I mentioned, influence of Danube School with these castles and abbeys. But look at that face, just really remarkable. Let's look at Adam and Eve. And Lucas Cranach the Elder did two really interesting versions of Adam and Eve. And one is in the Norton Simon. That's another reason to visit the Norton Simon. These two, this diptych, well, it's actually separated panels, but probably at one time together. It was disputed whether it would stay at the Norton Simon because it was actually stolen from a Jewish family in Germany and then sold, I don't know all the provenance, but it ended up at the Norton Simon, and it almost was sent back to Germany. I don't know all about the disputes, but it did take years to finally make the determination that it would stay at the Norton Simon. And so we have Adam and Eve done just a couple years apart, and they're covering their modesty with the leaves, and they're in a contrapposto. Now you can see that they're beautiful and elegant. She holds the apple. The serpent, is hovering over her, and she hasn't taken the bite yet. And again, that very unique, beautiful face. But I think I'm going to move on because we only have a couple minutes. And this is Judith with the head of Holofernes. Again, the faces look very reminiscent. And The truth is that this is from the apocryphal book of Judith, and she enters the 10th of this Assyrian Holofernes, who was helping Nebuchadnezzar take down the Israelites, as it were. And so she came in and she got him drunk and seduced him. But look at this version. She holds a sword. She's very beautiful. Again, that face is very similar to the one I showed you. Elaborate costume, and this gruesome, collection of blood and vessels and muscle. But everything else about it is very clean and well organized. So it's a very sort of interesting depiction of a bloody, gory scene. All right, let's go to, I'm going to go on to Albrecht Altdorfer. And Albrecht Altdorfer he was also sort of an interesting character because he really became popular. He was part of the Danube School. You can see this magnificent landscape that he shows, particularly on the right. But the problem with him is he was a vicious anti-Semite. And so he was responsible for tearing down synagogues. And this would be in, I believe, Cologne, but I could be wrong. Tearing down the synagogues, sending Jews out of the city. And so not a very nice guy, but an actual architect. And he was very important to his city. He was influenced by the Italians. You can see that in his coloration. And so we see the Marys trying to, again, comfort Mary. And then we see Jesus taking leave. And so it's a very sad depiction. But again, I want to bring up this landscape. Here on the woman's side, the grief is sparse and it's not, the coloration is quite different. So I see Haley is here. And let's see, I'm going to go to this image. In case we don't have questions, I will go on to it. And if not, we'll answer the questions. Haley, do we have any questions?
I am not seeing any questions in this chat. I'm not sure if we had any questions from the Facebook Live. Scott, is there any way that you can see if we have any questions on that end?
Probably, it might, let's see, I just want to go to this painting before. So while we're waiting, we have like 1 minute. If you don't mind, Haley, while we're waiting to see if there's any questions, I do want to show you a still life. I came upon this artist, George Flegel, and I didn't know much about him. I actually found a book in the library, a library sale. It was all in German. Of course, I don't read German. And I was fascinated by George Flegel. I can't tell you much about him. There's not a lot known, but he was the most incredible still life painter. And I just want to show you how hyper beautiful and realistic this is. We see cherries, the fruit of heaven, and we also see reference to the passion here. We see cheese as sort of longevity. We see bread and wine as a Eucharist. We think about the ephemeral nature of life with this insect here, or I should say fleeting nature and ephemeral nature of life. But just look at how he shadows the fruit, so hyper detailed. So if you really want to see a magnificent still life painter, do look at the work of George Flegel. Just absolutely amazing. So no questions, huh?
I did not see any questions.
All right. All right. So thank you all for joining us. I hope you got a little bit of an understanding of the German Renaissance. And I'll leave you with one more image in the last minute because it's pretty remarkable. And that is the Battle of Alexandria of Issus and Isis. And this is probably one of the most amazing world landscapes. We have thousands of troops assembled here. And it's actually an allegorical reference to the battles with the Ottoman Empire. So I did want to show you this because, in terms of German painting, this is a pretty important image. And look, again, that exquisite sky and just the multitude of figures. I mean, this is one of the most highly detailed paintings ever done. So with that, I will say adieu and thank you all for joining us. And Haley, do you have a question or?
Before you leave, from Ryan, it says, Karen, is there a good rule of thumb to remember how far behind is Germany in the Renaissance? Is it like 50 years behind Italy or 40?
Oh, that's excellent. I would say closer to 100. I mean, really, okay, in terms of the whole sort of era, because we're in the 14th century, we're seeing the emergence of the Renaissance with artists like Giotto. 14th century, we're looking at artists in Siena and Florence, but really, the Renaissance does not really get established till the 16th century in Germany. So I would say more like 100 years, more like 100 years.
So thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a very good question, though. Very, very important question.
All right.
Oh,
If there are no other questions, I would just like to thank Karen again for the amazing tour. And before you all go, I would just like to remind you all, if you'd like to watch any other of our previous lectures, they are on our Facebook page. And if you'd like any further information on the tours being put on by the Timken Museum, please check out our website, and the calendar for the events is on there as well with any details.
thank you all for coming and have a good rest of your day.